Okay, Tiriti or waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. We're going to look at this. I'm going to share something of the story for about half of my 40 minutes or whatever I've got, because I think an empathy with the topic itself is the starting place. Once we have an empathy, we can begin to consider together the strategic implications of the journey, not only that we as the church in New Zealand are involved in, but of the journey that our nation is involved in with regard to biculturalism. Because it is a journey, it is moving in a direction, and it's going to keep moving in that direction. So being up to speed with that's useful. I don't consider myself an authority on these things. I don't know if anybody does, really. I have, however, been considerably engaged in this conversation. I spoke about 150 times on the topic around 2012, 2013, 2014, primarily to pastors groups through the country and to combined church groups. And the goal at that stage of the journey in New Zealand was to try to get this thing on the radar of key church leaders in terms of the history, which became more popularised through the Gospel Bicentenary in 2014. Sorry, not in 1814. Was anyone alive in 1814, by the way? Okay, very good. Yeah, fantastic, yeah. I am involved also, I was going to say as an activist. It's probably true in some senses, but I'm highly outspoken on the treaty. For example, if you're disinterested in it and you think this whole Maori trend should stop, and you're a Christian, you're wrong. You know, that's an example of how I'm outspoken. There you go. So a good, nice, subtle introduction for where this is going. We have been a part of initiating the Hope Project, which has taken bicultural stories deliberately to the entire nation, so not just inside the walls of churches. I'm also behind with starting a publishing business to do it. A illustrated history series called The Chronicles of Paki, who's a little green Kiwi. We've created free teachers' resources to go with these. The goal is every school library, every public library, and every classroom. So these are probably the best gift you could buy your church leadership team for your elders board to read. And the whole point is that to lead cultural change, fat books are going to influence a few key thinkers, but the rest of us are going to need a cartoon version. Right, and if an elders, the different people on the elders board read this, they'll have an empathy with the treaty, then pass it down to some parents, then finally pass it to the children, and they'll read it for themselves if you don't in the Sunday school. So we've got more research going on at the moment with our team, a story at the invite of some from Ngapuhi going on. We've got a story for younger children called The First Kiwi Christmas. We hope to popularise and get into every public library, every school, because the narrative, the story behind this is so important in the identity conversation of who we are as a nation. And that is very strongly connected to Christianity within our nation, and that is going to be very connected to the future place of Christianity in our nation. So as Logan Craft said at the end of his talk yesterday, the future of New Zealand could end up being very different to the New Zealand we've known, but the determinant will be what people like those in this room choose to do. So, Father, may what I say be succinct for the scope of narrative that we're about to cover. May it be useful for your glory. Yeah, thank you, Jesus. Who would say they're on a bicultural journey of some kind at the moment, right? I think a lot of us are, and the bicentenary of the Gospel's first preaching was really instrumental in that, and I'll talk a bit about that cultural change in my closing address today. My view on public education is that it's very narrow. The Ministry of Education's website essentially says the Māori are the victims and the Pākehās are the perpetrator. So if you're white, hang your head in shame and confess your white privilege. So it doesn't say it that bluntly, but the story is not balanced. And I have written to them, but they have no reason to ever bother considering what I say. But to give you a different picture on that, and thanks to the author of whatever book it was I got this from, because I can't remember, what you've got is, in the centre of the stage, you've got the tangata whenua, the people of the land, the Māori, been here for a number of hundreds of years. And then the second person on the stage is the whalers, sealers and traders. And they're standing over here on the side of the stage in the sense that they've come to New Zealand for trade, they've come for profits, they don't really care about Māori at all, except they don't really want to get in trouble with them. But they've got the muskets, the Māori haven't yet, good for them. The next on the stage is the missionaries. And where are the missionaries? They are right next to the Māori. Because the missionaries are here with an altruistic, that's an all true heart and desire to actually help the Māori. No matter what critique you might have, whether you feel you agree with what you think you know about them or not, that's their motive, that's where their heart is, that's their intent. The fourth group on the stage are the settlers. They come here at the promise of Edward Gibbon Wakefield and his New Zealand company. They've come here for land and a better life, because this is the land of promise and the land of opportunity. They have little to no regard for the Māori. They are colonisers as far as their mindset goes. They are the average European, unlike the missionary, who has a completely different type of mindset. So to summarise, thus far we have, in the centre of the stage, the Māori, tangata whenua. On this side we have the whalers, sealers, traders. Next to the Māori we have and over here we've got the settlers. The last to come on the stage is the colonial office. And the question is, where is the colonial office going to stand on the stage? And the history tells us that they came over here and they stood right next to the missionary and the Māori because of the missionary. That's how we get to Tiriti or Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. The tragedy of the story is that their heart was already over here within 1 year. They appointed the New Zealand company the land purchasing agents of the Crown within a year of the signing of that. The New Zealand company was here for land, a better life, actually some philanthropic sort of purposes too. They were actually helping poor people get a new start in life. That was goodwill and actually charitable within the worldview of most cultures, including the Māori. But that certainly didn't measure up to the standards of the missionaries, whose standards and views we hold today as New Zealanders, whether we're Christian or not. So let's unpack this a little bit. 1807 is really the beginning of a new journey in the values, you could say, of Western civilization. That's the year that the Clapham sect, who I prefer to call the Clapham group because of the connotation sect has today, won against the slave trade and ended it. This led to phenomenal confidence that they could potentially change the world with their Christian values. And they started more than 233 charitable or humanitarian societies in the years that followed. When they looked at colonisation, their basic view that colonisation was very similar to slavery, because what you were doing was making slaves of people while they're on their land still. So their basic mindset was anti-colonisation. Now, the gospel's arrival in New Zealand has a little bit of a story behind it, but 1814, 25th December, Christmas Day, is the date when the gospel was first preached on the soil at the invitation of Māori. Now, the local chief who invited was named Ruatara. He had connected with the Reverend Samuel Marsden, I am guessing about 1807, 1808. Marsden had many Māori chiefs as guests in his house in Parramatta, Sydney, and already had his own written version of Te Reo Māori that he was beginning to put together as he learnt their language while they were learning his. He then went to England around 1809, and as he got on a ship to come back, he discovered Ruatara, who he already knew, locked in the basement of the ship, like he was a slave or something. What had happened was that Ruatara, as a chief of Ngāpuhi, had decided to go to England and meet King George III, who'd love to meet a chief of standing. And he had been used as a free deckhand on the ship, but when he reached England and said he was going to meet King George, all the sailors just laughed at him, thought, "You fool, man, you're a nobody," and they locked him in the bows of the ship. So he never actually ended up walking through England. The most he might have walked, that I'm aware, is actually across the yards all the ships were parked in, to eventually be taken from one to another to get rid of him, because having him there was a problem. So he's locked in the bows of a ship, and he is sick with tuberculosis. He was very sick. So Marsden finds him and says, "What are you doing here?" and takes him back to his own and his wife's cabin, where they begin to nurse him back to health over the 3 to 4 months following on the ship. The nursing to health continues for 7 more months at Marsden's home in Parramatta, Sydney. Through this, a relationship of trust is consolidated. Chief Te Pahi had invited Marsden to establish a first mission settlement in New Zealand prior. Te Pahi, who was Ruatara's uncle, had been unjustly killed. Ruatara therefore re-extended the invitation of his uncle. Now, Marsden is often critiqued as, and the missionaries as a whole, are kind of slagged off as if they were only interested in conversionism. And to quote Marsden on this, he actually said, "You have to civilise before you Christianise." And so basically that would be all the media clip would give, right? A 10-second or an 8-second quote, and he's just interested in religious conversion and doesn't actually care about the Māori. The opposite is actually the case. When he said you've got to civilise before Christianise, we've got to look at what civilised meant in that day and age, because words change meaning. And it didn't mean you had to sit around like an Englishman or an Englishwoman with a knife and a fork at a table, talking in some kind of weird accent. It meant that Māori were still a primitive tribal feudal people, killing each other, eating each other, living under phenomenal superstitions that often would result in death. There was infanticide, there was human sacrifice, there were all manner of things. And he just thought, we've got to help them in some practical ways and earn our stripes. In other words, if you put it in modern language, it's really the same as your church probably has community ministries that fail to communicate very much about the gospel. And the rationale would be we've got to show them the gospel with our actions and maybe we'll share some words. That's where Marsden was at. And the real critique against him over the decade that followed was that he really failed to share the gospel with Māori through the mission. He incidentally wasn't living here as a missionary. He came here about 9 times, if I recall correctly. 3 families, the Kings, the Kendalls and the Halls, moved here to establish the first invited Pākehā settlement, 1814 at Rangihoa. It's Oihi Bay, 30 minutes north of Kerikeri in Northland. Marsden therefore invested heavily in trying to help Māori, and so even when Ruatara was at his place, he began to teach him the husbandry of different types of animals, so how to look after them and breed them and all that, to teach them about the management of different crops, introduce them to crazy fruit, like fruit this big that could be eaten. Māori had never seen such a thing as a peach before, and Ruatara was actually mocked by other chiefs when he planted a peach tree and told them about the fruit. They never believed anything could exist that would have that much food on one piece of fruit. And months later, or 2 years or however long later, when it eventually fruited, he received that much more mana for these amazing things he was bringing to the country. Out of his own back pocket, Marsden gifted cows. He gifted sheep. He gifted the first seed supplies to grow new crops, like maize and like wheat. Obviously, fruit trees and all manner of other things. Some of those gifts that he sent were stolen by sailors. It was like the wild, wild west. It was a crazy era of history. And eventually Marsden, to help the New Zealand mission, because the sailors were so untrustworthy, actually bought his own ship with his own money to enable the New Zealand mission and to try to supply it. He was greatly criticised for not supporting the New Zealand mission enough, though, because he believed that the missionaries who lived here had to work out how to be self-sustaining. And he was possibly a bit too harsh in that regard. They were the pawns in the hands of Māori, who totally had the upper hand, and they ate or didn't eat at the mercy of Māori. And when Māori worked out what a musket did, as an example, all you have to do is starve them for long enough. Eventually, they'll sell you the musket. So did missionaries sell muskets? Nearly every one of them, for survival, handed over their musket at some point. One of them is noted for having actually sold them, and there's nothing wrong with selling a weapon that can be used for hunting, is there? But it quickly became apparent that Māori weren't going to use them to hunt animals or for those sorts of things, and it very quickly became established that to ever sell a musket to a Māori was morally wrong. So we jump forward from there to probably Henry Williams, who came over as a missionary in 1826, and he had been in the Napoleonic Wars. He was a Navy man. It's said he'd seen enough bloodshed for 2 lifetimes, and as a result, it's believed by many that he might have been a pacifist by that point in time. To give you one anecdote that would explain the character of this man, who would not compromise for anything. He'd already seen death in the eye many times. He would walk across battlefields where Māori were fighting each other, including muskets, unprotected, yelling at them and telling them to put their weapons down. Because this isn't the way of God. You've got to choose to love your enemies and to forgive, right in the midst of fighting. He was often called in to negotiate peace before battles started after that. He was held in incredibly high esteem by Māori. But when he looked at the situation in New Zealand, he says, look, you've been doing flippin' community ministry, civilising for all of these years, and none of them have faith yet. They're still killing each other. There's all kinds of barbaric violences going on. He says they need to know there's a God who loves them and that there's an obligation upon them to love others. And so he started to preach the straight gospel. And from that point, you move towards the first Christian convert, who was named Christian Rangi, baptised in 1828. And a journey begins. It goes through to a famed story known as the Tiriti story, where Kuku has a Gospel of Luke, because they've created the written language by now, and when his daughter is murdered, he chooses to forgive, but that Gospel is stolen. That's later found down in the Kapiti, where Te Atiawa from Taranaki were hanging out in those days. And so this narrative of Christian forgiveness and reconciliation, where Oita, responsible for the murder, begins to embrace faith, makes peace with Ngā Kuku, this kind of thing begins to have a ripple effect through the nation. Kato and Te Whiwhi, who hear the gospel, begin to embrace it. Kato was the son of the warring chief Te Rauparaha. They ask for more scriptures when a released slave from Ngā Puhi, who was a Christian, called Ripaho, also called Mataho, comes down and he can read. He goes up to Rotorua, comes back with some scriptures. The so-called Te Rore Gospel of Luke is amongst them. Kato and Te Whiwhi go to apologise to tribes on the South Island that their dad has dominated and they've been a part of raiding and killing and all of these sort of things. Others are doing the same thing, and you end up in an era with 200 to 300 Māori evangelists travelling around the nation. You end up with a ship's captain pulling up for water supplies on the west coast of the South Island and saying, "Decidedly, I tell you, every Māori we met was thoroughly Christian." The Māori embraced the faith to the point where they say that by 1850, 1860, estimates range between 50% and 2/3 of all Māori attending a church service on a Sunday. Those services, of course, were in Te Reo Māori. It was a Māori format of church initiated by the missionaries, duplicated by Māori amongst themselves. Education happened the same. There was a format of schooling in Te Reo Māori, started by the missionaries and duplicated by Māori right throughout the nation. 1836, there is a bill passed in British Parliament that opens New Zealand for limited colonisation. Lord Glenig, who is a friend of the missionaries, in other words, you've got this Clapham Group DNA. This is the thing to understand in the pre-treaty history. These guys are radicals who believe the Bible and who are crazy enough to think they can change the world. And they are now in all sorts of positions within society. Lord Glenig is one of them, and he discovers that Edward Gibbon Wakefield is intending to start sending ships of settlers to New Zealand. He's horrified, and they begin to discuss how they could stop this, because they are anti-colonialistic in their basic ideas. You end up a little bit later with James Stephens, the nephew of William Wilberforce, penning thoughts on a radical treaty that could be made with Māori. One of the bases for the treaty is that Māori in 1831 had sent one letter requesting British intervention to deal with the unruly behaviour of Pākehā, who were here in New Zealand, and Henry Williams was involved with that. Also in 1835 you had He Whakaputanga, the Declaration of Independence, which came about with a confederation of chiefs who'd been together since about 1812, and with the help of Busby and Henry Williams, they put together this declaration which gave Māori the appearance of sovereignty, that there was the Māori people, because there's really hardly ever been the Māori people in New Zealand. There are the Māori peoples. They are a tribal people. So that gave an impression of sovereignty, which made a possibility that Britain could create a treaty with the Māori people of New Zealand, because they actually existed as a unit. So that document from James Stephens ends up in the hands of Lord Normanby, another evangelical Christian, who thinks we need to find someone unbelievably tough, who knows the seas, who knows international law, who's got loads of experience and is uncompromisable. And they found a man who was named Hobson. And so Hobson's sent on a recce trip to New Zealand. He comes back later with a report. Hobson had been gifted to the Navy at age 9. He had spent his teenage years in the Napoleonic Wars. He had battled piracy around the world. He had been twice captured by pirates and held for ransom. He was a seriously tough fella, but he was aligned to the values of these Christians. So that's why they chose him. So he is commissioned, and the key words in this commission, which is a collection of papers that were given to him to create the treaty, were that his mission was to avert this disaster, but if not possible, to mitigate it. So to avert this disaster, the disaster is colonisation, but if you cannot stop colonisation, your job is to mitigate, to soften the blow of it. Do something to bring about something good here, because we don't want this to happen, but we're powerless. The doors have been opened in Britain for the colonisation of New Zealand to proceed. And so that's what Te Tiriti or waitangi is. And there's a whole history around it, and I really do think the best resource is our Treaty of Waitangi series. 5 illustrated history stories, $64.90. I don't think you'd ever regret buying it. You can probably buy a fat book for $40 or $50, and if you can read that, by all means go for it. Bible and Treaty would be one of the most detail-filled examples of that many have read, and we've sold multiple of those ourselves. But this will give you incredible facts, and all of our research involves the iwi, and the descendants of those involved, including the Pākehā descendants of those involved, as well as through academic historians, including Māori historians within that. In short, the treaty comes about. The missionaries are the negotiators of the treaty. I think that Hone Heke's comments in it are intriguing and important. In the TV documentary enacting of it, Hone Heke, at one point, he says, "Who are we mere natives to make a decision on this? It's up to you, our fathers," referring to the missionaries, and you, Governor Hobson, to decide for us. And they kind of portray him as this cheeky fella, and he's winking across to his mates, and they're all having a chuckle at the expense of the missionaries, and Hobson, because he's really just mocking them. And that's the way that they're trying in today's academia to explain away his words. But I want to suggest to you that I think he was actually dead sincere. Any person who had travelled knew what was going on. The British were the military superpower. And all respect to Māori and their fighting tactics, Battle of Gatepā to be noted, they had no chance if the British decided to take them over. And those who had travelled understood this. Even Ruatara, in his conversations on the ship with Marsden travelling to New Zealand in 1814, talked to Marsden about his concerns that New Zealand might one day be colonised in the same way that Australia had. And Marsden's words seemed to dismiss it and say, no, there's no way that would ever happen. And of course, Marsden turned out to be wrong on that. I need to jump forward because my time is going to go so incredibly quickly. So Hone Heke, what was he really saying? I think he was saying, you missionaries have travelled, and I'm getting the impression that you know far more than we do about the danger that is actually coming to us now. Consider the previous 2 months of what had happened. A man named Octavius Hadfield had arrived in New Zealand. He's hailed as the greatest New Zealander to ever have lived. So if you want to know how much we don't know about our history, there's a man hailed as the greatest New Zealander ever to have lived. 22 years of age, sick as anything, suspected to die soon. And so he says, I'm going to be a missionary so I can do some good before I'm dead. So he comes as a missionary to New Zealand, and then Katu and Te Whiwhi, who have come to faith down at the Waitangi area, they come up to meet the great Henry Williams, and they say, we would like a missionary to come down and teach us from the Bible so we can understand this faith better. And he says, look, I haven't got anybody that can go down. We're short on manpower. Note that at the time the treaty was signed, you've got 36 Church Missionary Society missionaries in the country, 2,000 settlers, maybe 60 to 80,000 Māori. So there's not a lot of missionaries. They're a very small, unbelievably influential group. And here Octavius Hadfield says, I might as well go. Let me go. I'm going to die here, I die there. I know I'm going to die. Let me go. So they jump on a ship, and as they come down to Wellington, they get caught in a storm and blown across to Nelson, where they discover land that had just been purchased. A lot of injustice, there'd been some fighting, there was confusion, and people were upset. They get on the ship and they come into Port Nicholson, now named Wellington, and discover that all the land you can see had just been purchased, and Māori are being shifted off the land because we've purchased it from you. Māori aren't even understanding what purchase means. You don't own land, land owns you. Land was here well before you were here, it'll be here well after, and we are stewards together as our iwi, and you of your iwi and your land. We are stewards of that land, we don't own it. And so they've sold land and they're in confusion, and he realises, man, this colonisation thing is happening fast. And so he walks up to Waikanai, gets Octavius Hadfield settled, walks promptly to Tauranga, hops on a ship, gets himself back to Paihia in Northland, where with a couple of days later, Pataone, a great warring chief, requests to be baptised and becomes a Christian after many years of journeying. There's this whole story there. And 10 days later, you've got the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. I mean, so Williams is in the room with stories right now of colonisation taking place and Māori being kicked off their lands and losing it, as indeed also had many Māori in Northland already to settlers and to others who had purchased it unjustly. And so the treaty is signed to really, in essence, to protect Māori so that they can preserve their culture, they can preserve their, you could say, their sovereignty, their leadership, their governorship over their own people, over their own lands. That would include all of their taonga, their treasures, their waters, their fish, the animals, the birds, everything that is there that is part of their land and their area. And then have a look at what happens. Within a year, I've already told you that the Crown had moved its allegiance over there with the settlers. You've got bloodshed within 5 years. And then by the 1860s, you've got some bishops that come in too who really don't get the treaty and don't fully value it as they could have. That's really unhelpful. And then by 1860, you've got the first land war. You've got Wiremu from Te Atiawa in northern Taranaki. I'm from South Taranaki, which is Ngāti Ruanui territory. And he's down there in Waikanai in the Kapiti. That's where they're hanging out in those days. And he suddenly discovers that one of his fellas has just sold his lands in Waitara to the Crown. I'm the paramount chief. He can't sell my land. And Octavius Hadfield, who, by the way, lived for 66 more years after thinking he would die, says, they'll never take your land. There's no way. And everyone's agreed. Eventually, it gets intense. I better go occupy and build a pa to protect my lands. So he goes up there with his people, and Governor Brown, against all expectation, attacks. That's the first land war. Wiremu is defeated. Wiremu at this point is a Christian. Wiremu carries a Bible with him probably everywhere he goes, both because of a devotion to this God of love and grace, but possibly also superstitions. The Bible is like a charm, lucky charm to carry maybe as well. I don't know, but all of that would be mixed up in times like that. And it's said of him that he went to live in the Central Plateau area for a while, and then he came back and he made peace with those who lived on his lands. And try and understand the grief here. He's the paramount chief. He owns these lands and he looks after his people on them. It is their lands. He came back and made peace with people who were now farming and owned his lands. He went to Parihaka for a time, and the whole deal at Parihaka is Māori trying to deal with the encroaching Pākehā who are just walking right over top of them and doing so many unjust things. But if you believe in a God of grace and love and forgiveness, how do you respond to that? Do you respond with violence or do you respond with pacifism? And so that's the DNA. Parihaka is about trying to apply Jesus' principles in a situation where Māori were being walked over and they were the ones who were applying them. Wiremu then retreated up the Wanganui River, where he lived out the rest of his days just living a native life in the bush. You imagine the sadness, you imagine the grief. Let's come up to the Waikato. You've got an invasion road being built across the Bombays and down through Pocono and those sort of areas. At first, when I heard it called an invasion road, I just thought, no, that's just Maori talk, But as I investigated, no, it was an invasion road. They wanted land. And so Māori was saying, we're not selling you land. You're building a road on our land. You're not welcome here. And so they brought out the muskets and protected themselves. So the Māori began to fight. Whoops, they were fighting the British Crown, punishable by the loss of everything that you've got. Now, Wiremu Tamihana Tarapipipi Waharoa is a thoroughly Christian chief who lived over sort of near Matamata. There's a place there called Waharoa, which gives the general geography. And he's like a pacifist, and he refuses to join the fighting until the invasion road is reaching as far as there, right across the Waikato. They grab some of their women and children, they throw them in a village in some huts for safety so they'd be away from the potential fighting. The British troops get there first and burn the huts and burn many of the women and children to death inside the huts. Tarapipipi doesn't know what to do. He has to defend his people, he's the chief. He set up a village called Perea, named after Berea in the Bible, where they studied the Word of God to see what was true. They've got a bell every morning at 7. Everybody in the community comes for chapel. They are thoroughly Christian. So he picks up the taiaha and he fights for a while, but soon realises they have no chance. You can't fight the British. They're the superpower. They've got more weapons and they've got a never-ending supply of warriors who keep coming across on ships from over the sea. And so he makes peace that's interpreted as a surrender. And as a consequence, he loses every piece of land that he has. How's that for justice? He finishes his days down in Wellington. A few days before he dies, he's playing cards, probably with cigars and a whiskey on the table, with some of the people who are leading in different parts of New Zealand, meeting for governmental decisions. And he jokes with them, hey, come on, play me, I'll play this with you. If I lose, you can take my lands. And everyone laughs, because he's got no lands, and everybody knows that. And he finishes saying to his men, honour the ways of God and of man. Look at that for godly character in the face of gross injustice. To help the empathy with this, go a bit further. I want you to imagine that I'm a farm owner, and I'm living in the Bay of Plenty, because I live in Tauranga, and I own 10 farms, there's a whole lot of orchards on them. I'm a multi-millionaire. I'm worth, $40, $80 million. Just go for something ridiculous. And one day you come in and you decide that you're just going to take my lands, and if I disagree with you, then you're going to charge me with disagreeing with you, and that's the reason you can take my lands. And so you just take them. I'm soul destroyed. I've inherited this from those who were before me, from my father, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. It's been in the family for generations further than we can ever remember or have record for. I've lost everything. I can't care for my wife. I can't care for my children. I thought I had till 3 p.m. Wow. Yeah, okay. Oh my goodness. To take that story really short, because I want to give you some of the analysis. I'm soul destroyed, and my kids I go to the bottle, and my kids end up growing up with problems, and they're fighting, and I don't really take care of them as I should or could. And then they have a relationship, and there's a kid there, and a relationship with someone else, and there's a kid there. And then there's some violence, there's some alcoholism, and there's some pee use, and there's some marijuana, and there's some crime, and there's some imprisonment. And it goes down until I've got great-grandkids and great-great-grandkids, and now I'm an old man. And my whole family is wrecked, and I feel ashamed of what we've become. But I'm soul destroyed at what you did to me. And then you have the audacity to come to me and say, actually, we realize we did some wrong back when you were 30, and we've come to say sorry. And here we go, we'd like to give you $600,000 as a token of our apology. That's the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal. And what I have to suck up is the gross injustice and the way you've screwed up my family and my kids and my grandkids and my great-grandkids, and then have the audacity to give me a token of your sincerity of $600,000 when you should be giving me $80 million or far more. And so I suck it up, and I'm going to feel grumpy for a few years. And don't you dare tell me to get over it, because I feel grumpy for a reason. So just keep your mouth shut for a while, will you? And I start to deal with that grief, and I take that $600,000 or whatever number I said, and I go and buy myself a little lifestyle property. It's not overly flash. But you know what? I've got 5 acres, and I get myself a couple of sheep and a couple of cows. I've got some chooks, got a little pig thing going on there, and one day I've got one of my grandkids over, and I wake up early in the morning, and I smoke my fag, and I drink my coffee, and I look over the glistening grass, the dew on the grass, and I feel like a man again for the first time in about 60 years. And I say hi to my grandson or great-grandson who's running around, and I take him off. I say, I'm going to show you today how to dag sheep. I'm going to show you today how to fix a fence. My mana is beginning to be restored. It's called the mana Māori, the pride of being Māori. This is what the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal is about. Because a kid in 1890 would be disciplined if they used anything in Te Reo Māori in a classroom. Apanana Ngata is a key figure to watch. You wait for Dame Whina Cooper's March on Parliament, 1975. They endorsed the Treaty of Waitangi Tribunal to investigate sales of land beyond that, because Māori were still losing land that they did have. 1985, our government endorses the treaty, all claims back to 1840. That's the nature of what's going on. And it's completely just. And if you think that the total treaty settlements, which are going to be $2 billion-ish in total, is too much, get over yourself. Let's just give them 4 to be done with it. If you want to complain again, let's give them 8. Okay, and if you're really going to keep complaining, we're going to double it every time until you stop talking. Because you don't get it. Jacinda's decision to give a first free year of education to tertiary students by 3 and a bit years will already have cost more money than all treaty settlements combined. It's a phenomenally small amount of money, especially in proportion to what has been lost. If we were to look very quickly at the 4 points, there they are. That was it, gone. Let's just, so in other words, from a justice point of view, we must honour the treaty. It's established because of the trust in the missionaries, not anybody else. Hobson went to try and get signatories. They wouldn't sign for Hobson. That's how the secular people tell it, though. They only signed where missionaries went. And they had people from government go to get signatories in other places with no missionaries. And guess who signed? No one did, or a very, very few did. The missionaries trust because they were under God. Because Māori understood the missionaries were different to all the rest. It's the only reason the treaty was trusted. It's the only reason it happened. The missionaries were betrayed and Māori were betrayed. But out of the 2 of those, the fact is the missionaries hardly even matter. The Māori betrayal was unbelievable. Things that are being restored. Let's go real quick. Economics. This is a change into the next 20 to 40 years. The Māori economy is $40 billion. I predict Māori iwi to be some of the biggest contributors to the charity sector in 20 to 40 years. The mana whenua, the mana Māori, being Māori, having land, it's being restored. There are iwi already looking at healthcare plans for everyone in the iwi. There are iwi with decisions already. They want to make sure none of their people are on the unemployment benefit. They want to take care of healthcare. They want to take care of education. So this whole idea of Waikato going out there, Tainui, and spending $30 million on a casino and losing it, and the Maori are wasting their money, and all of this kind of rant. Move on, folks. How much do you think after the $170 million settlement and losing $30 million, how much do you think Tainui's worth today? The answer is $1.37 billion. Give it 2 years, that'll be $1,500 million and increasing. They're doing fantastically with their finances, and thank God that they are, because that still wouldn't be anywhere near the value of what they lost. Secondly, the Mann and Māori is being restored. Māori are looking at themselves and instead of being ashamed of being brown, they're now taking pride in being brown. They're taking pride in their language. There are 3 official languages in New Zealand: English, Te Reo Māori, and Sign Language. You can speak in any one of those languages in the public square, and the onus of interpretation is upon the hearer, not the speaker. To speak Te Reo Māori in a court of law, you have to give 2 weeks' notice, and they will arrange an interpreter. If you don't think that trend is going to go further, you're not looking and you're not seeing what's happening. So bilingualism is going to go stacks further. Kuta kaupapa, the Māori schools started late 70s, and you've got people now in their 30s whose first language is Te Reo Māori. There's quite a few of them. They're the ones who are bicultural. You see, we're a bicultural nation, but we're living monoculturally. The ones who aren't are many of the Māori. You just don't know how Māori they are. But this trend, this line is moving, and it's going to keep going. For a justice reason, you can't argue with that. You live in a bicultural nation. That's your heritage. That's our founding document. But for a wisdom reason, you're a Christian. You're the author of the Treaty of Waitangi in many regards. There's this very big, significant spiritual dynamic to this. Point 3. Am I going fast enough here, Todd? Just racing through my last 2 points now. Yep. Name it down. Very good. How are the Māori going to come to faith? Here it is, number 4. We're going to embrace biculturalism in the church on a slow but specific directional journey. As we tell the story of our bicultural beginnings, we're going to value it. We're going to realise that saying a bit of kia ora is probably good. And we're going to try and learn a little bit more te reo as we go and maybe sing a song in te reo. Because what is it to be bicultural? To be bicultural means you are able to operate in 2 separate modes and to just fluidly go between them without any awkwardness. You hear it? 2 modes of operation that run in parallel, and you're able to shift between them. So as our churches begin to embrace these values, and as we tell the pre-treaty story, Māori are hearing it, and we've got stories of this from Hope Project, we've got stories of this from this, and guess what? They just turn up at church. Because they suddenly realise something significant. You see, is Christianity an imposition of colonisation? The public narrative is yes. But if you know the pre-treaty story, is Christianity an imposition of colonisation? No. So as we've had the pre-colonisation, we had colonisation, we now have an era which is decolonisation. That's the era we're in. Does decolonising mean de-Christianising? You see, the public idea is yes, but if we understand that pre-treaty history, Māori get it. No. Which means they can be restored to the church, and who will reach Māori? Māori will. They're having hui all over the country already. In the last 6 years, we've seen the church, I think the tipping point was 2017 for the church nationally. Kaitaia from the top down to Bluff. And they are already beginning to meet on marae all across the country doing these things. So, let's carry on the journey. Let's keep reading. Let's keep understanding. Let's keep telling the story, because telling the story is a key part of it. And the spiritual implication is that we're in a battle, ultimately, you could say, against secularism. And one of the trump cards we have is a thing called biculturalism. Because in secularism, you can't pray in the public square. But in biculturalism, in Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview, the spiritual is an intrinsic part of life. Karakia is a part of everything you do. And you're either tangata whenua, people of the land, or you're tangata tiriti. If you don't want to be one of them, you're called a coloniser, and you should live in Australia. So if you're not a Māori here, you're tangata tiriti. The treaty is the ground you stand upon. And if once you understand that ground, you have the right, not just by being brown, you have the right by right of being a New Zealander standing on Te Tiriti or Waitangi to have karakia in any place. The spiritual is now a part of holistic care. It's through all our social welfare documents and mandates, because in the Māori worldview, you can't separate the spiritual. And if we can help Māori be restored to Christ through telling the story and learning to be a bit more accepting and bicultural ourselves, then they will increasingly keep the name of Ihu Karaiti within their prayers. We have an unbelievable spiritual opportunity into the future within this. So should we stop there? And are you thinking Q&A with...
Yes. We give David a hand. I don't know about you, but I wish my history teachers would have been half that interesting and passionate. I wouldn't have fallen asleep. I reckon, huh? I wouldn't have fallen asleep in class. So we're going to give them as much as we can, 10 minutes, and then we got break. So questions?
Thank you very much, Dave, for your incredible overview. My question is, with the biculturalism versus secularism, the tension between the Maorification of Christianity, so the karakia, but they're calling on whoever, yeah? So how do you see that kind of tension being navigated?
This is where the idea is that to de-Christianise, if it means to decolonise, right? If to decolonise means to de-Christianise, that Māori who have typically prayed in the name of Ihu Karaiti on a marae as much as we would in a church, decide to go back to their pre-European spirituality. So that's the trend, and it's a definite trend right throughout our country. And the more secular you get, which is going to be, the liberal sciences and the universities, therefore through education and government, the more that's going to be the case. However, freedom of religion is enshrined. It's the 4th article of the treaty as well. And I think what it's going to come down to is our confidence. Only through understanding the treaty do we have a right to begin to do this as a non-Māori. But once we understand the treaty, we have a phenomenal platform just to pray prayers in the name of Ihu Karaiti within the mix. And Māori, as they become restored, hopefully, to the gospel and to the God who is not a Westerner, he's a Middle Eastern for starters in his human, appearance. As they begin to be restored, they will also become leaders that keep acceptability, I believe, with the name of Ihu Karaiti within the public square. So I'm already involved in places that are secular, where people, just say, we start all our meetings with karakia, and then they pray in English. And there's a stack of non-Christian people in that place, and are entirely happy with that. As long as that prayer isn't the gospel in disguise with an agenda, because people can feel that. So it's tense. And I still think it could go either way. But if we look at what's happening, is God on this or what? Right? In 6 years, we have gone from most Christians in New Zealand not caring an iota about this. That the change will be typified, and I'll share it in my closing address later, but if you were to suggest having a Te Reo Māori language course in your church in 2012, there's hardly a church in the country where someone would have said, "What would you do that for, man? It's got nothing to do with church." You do that today, you'd hardly have a church where some people wouldn't be coming forward saying, "Awesome." I know of a church that's been asked if they teach Te Reo Māori, then they never even had the idea of having a course. So people, there's something happening. In Tauranga, where I live, there's a dawn service on Waitangi Day. I would say it's principally attended by Christians now. The attendance is going up and up and up, and the Māori know. The Māori aren't dumb. They see the dynamic that's at play there. So God's doing this. God's on this, but we need to embrace the journey. 750 marae in New Zealand, maybe 3,500 churches. We've got to build relationship with every one of those marae and engage the conversation. Yeah.
So to carry on that thought, with the church reconciling with Māori, getting back on the stage next to Māori, what is that looking like in terms of a model in the church? You've mentioned some, but inside the church, that biculturalism.
Yeah, I think some people are articulating this and giving a sort of list of things, and I think some are kind of saying you're going to end up being tino rangatiratanga Māori, fully Māori, and I don't think that's what we're doing. But biculturalism, that's why I defined it. I think it's being free to operate in 2 modes of operation comfortably, and so we end up in a situation with a couple of Māori coming into the meeting. The watch goes out the window for starters. Tikanga is protocol, right? Culture. It just rolls differently. So I got a mate who's Māori. My advice to him when he was asking me a couple of years ago was, I said, don't try and change anything, but how about release yourself to be yourself instead of pretending to be Pākehā? So he just started throwing in bits of te reo and whatever being himself. Within 6 months, he had white church members helping with the emceeing at the end, praying closing karakia in te reo Māori. The whole church went like that. And, but the church that I attend doesn't have many Māori, and the pastors have very wisely not rushed into it. And the senior pastors, he and her together, but he has recently started using kia ora and things like this in greetings after waiting a couple of years before he even started to do that. And it's been the right thing to do. If we rush the journey, it's leadership through change. We will stuff things up. And baby steps, and every environment different. If you're a church leader, it's leadership through change. So embrace that dynamic. How far will it go? I think we have no idea how far it might go, but it's going to have to go at a pace we can kind of handle, together like that. Yeah.
Hi, I'm just a bit curious. Yeah, I don't know whether the question is relevant, but they've just removed the Lord from the prayer in the Parliament. How does the Treaty of Waitangi can it impact on this and say bring the Lord's Prayer, bring the prayer of the Lord back in, or no? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't think it can. I think that the fourth article of the treaty protects religious freedom. It doesn't necessarily have to be Christian religious freedom. When the first Parliament met, the history is that New Zealand was going to be secular, meaning separation of church and state. It wouldn't be definitely Catholic or definitely Anglican, but there was no question in the minds of most that we were Christian. So when they started the first Parliament, they needed someone to open in prayer, but they couldn't invite the Anglican vicar because that would make us Anglican. You couldn't invite the Methodist minister because that would make us Methodist. So a man was sent down the street to find the first minister or pastor he could find and to bring them back. I believe it was a Methodist, so we're a Methodist country. Right? But in other words, but when they make laws to protect laws, and when they made the laws to protect the laws, they never made laws to protect the prayer. And the reason is that we were a Christian nation, and they never even imagined a day when we would do any different. And Māori and Pākehā together were very comfortable with that back then. We've come to a different era. We have been denied knowledge as a nation of our own cultural heritage, which would validate the Christian prayer. And at the moment, the weight in the public square is this, down there, we're losing. That's why we need to begin to tell the story. Yeah. So it could one day flip back, and it might end up being something that will be determined by the Speaker of the House, whoever that is. I don't know.
Thanks, Dave, for your input. Sorry, I arrived a little bit late. Biculturalism, I don't know if you define that. See, I'm in Auckland, I'm looking at multicultural. We have Chinese, yes. We have all kinds of people. So to me, to be bicultural talks about, well, there's just Europeans and Maori here, and I'm thinking, well, actually, we're more than that. So I wonder if you could speak to that.
Sure, actually, a great question. So I would say tangata whenua is the people of the land, and they do have a status in New Zealand, just as a Samoan would in Samoa and a Tongan would in Tonga. Tangata Tiriti is everybody else, and that includes multiple races for starters. And I have found even Chinese very comfortable to come to New Zealand and understand that you've got a European culture and you've got the original people here who are the Māori, and then they go and join Te Reo language courses along with everybody else. So I would say, in understanding this, that we are a bicultural nation by constitution, but we are multicultural in practice, because you've just got to be polite to everybody. And and I would say in the same way that we are a Christian nation by definition, but we are multi-religious by practice in exactly the same pattern, because Christianity is our founding values, but that includes the freedom of the will, therefore the freedom of religion, therefore we must give equal acceptance and opportunity to people irrespective of religion. And I think if you remove that one, you're going to lose this one. And over here, that's the constitutional base. Yeah.
I just had 2 points. The first one is that before Europeans arrived, Maori referred to people of your own iwi. So, for example, if I was Tainui and you were Ngāti Whātua, my iwi would be Māori and you guys would be Pākehā. And then when Europeans arrived, this changed. Anyone who didn't look Māori, or anyone who looked European or Chinese, they were Pākehā. Yes. And all the brown people were Māori. Yep. And I just think, in today's 21st century New Zealand society, we're all very mixed, and anthropologists tell us that there's no fully blooded Maori in the country anymore, unfortunately. I've kind of been thinking, well, why don't we, anyone who's Kiwi, regardless of ethnic backgrounds, why don't we refer to ourselves as Maori, and the more recent immigrants, someone who's just moved here from England or Australia or Korea or wherever is Pākehā. So I just want to know your thoughts on that. And the second thing, I'll be really quick. Oh, all right, we'll just answer that. I'll share the other thing with you later.
Yeah, very good.
What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Māori is a nationality, so a person with Māori blood can justifiably say they're Māori, they're quarter Māori, they're a 16th Māori, and if they choose to identify within that heritage, I think that's their right. But I think it is an ethnicity, and I couldn't call myself Chinese by the same regard that I couldn't call myself Māori. So yeah, I think it is an ethnicity. Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please consider supporting us to get more content just like this. Visit support.thinkingmatters.org.nz or click on the link in the description.